Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight's discussion is going to focus on the government of Rwanda's national budget 2019-2020. On this, we are going to discuss a couple of things, such as top priority expenditure priorities, citizen expectations, implications on the taxpayer, and economic self-financing. Joining the show is Paul Frobisher Mugambwa, who is Associate Tax Director at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Paul Frobisher, thank you for joining the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Great. My name is Dana Mpisi. I am the host of The Square. As always, the host is made out of resident panelists. And I'll start with my right, Ephraim Wamenje. Great to have you on the show.
Likewise, Dee. Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure to have you. We are also joined by Brenna Namata, resident panelist of The Square. Great to have you, Brenna.
Thank you, Dana.
As always, we're usually joined by Charles Haber. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us, but I'm sure he's watching. Now, before we get into things, as we always do, I would like us to start with a few midweek recaps.
Yeah.
Ephraim, I'll start with you just very briefly.
So, one very important one is Facebook announcing that it's going to launch, I would call it, they are calling it Libra. So it's a digital payment platform of sorts. So the idea is to allow people from anywhere across the world to be able to save, transact money across many of its platforms. I think, and I find it very interesting because Facebook has a huge number across its platforms, has a huge number of people accessing it. So it's a really interesting. It'll be really interesting to see how they're able to scale it. And I think it's we've always talked about blockchain technology and we've talked about cryptocurrency on the Square.
Yes.
And it's interesting to see how always the challenge has been that it seems like it is something that is not being pushed by the big players, or at least large institutions or large companies that have an interest that if they had an interest, it would actually move the technology much faster. So it's interesting to see that that's happening now. I think the timing is also very interesting. Considering the conversation around 5G, and I would say the war or the Cold War of sorts between Chinese technology companies and the US and vice versa. So we'll see how that works out and how that pans out.
I think we should have a discussion once again on the Square regarding that topic, like we did a couple of weeks back. Brenna, midweek recap.
This week I'm sending out a shout out to the men in the green uniform.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because I went to Southwest.
Yes.
At Nyungwe for the weekend.
Yes.
And it's very nice.
She looks excited.
I know.
Yes, I mean, I can't explain it. Connecting with nature. So two things. One, I think Rwandans should go to Nyungwe. It's really nice, and it's still affordable. It's just 3,000.
I think it's still affordable.
It's 3,000.
3,000, I mean, francs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought you were
So before waking up and
$3,000.
Yeah,
Wait,
no, 3,000 francs. Just 3,000 francs.
Okay.
Because when you talk about Nyungwe, most people imagine like it's
yes.
a couple of, I don't know, people may think
that's why they
expensive.
thought it was $3,000.
Yes,
exactly.
So before the rates actually double, like we have seen elsewhere, I think people should consider visiting.
I am in Nyungwe next week.
Yeah, it's really nice.
Yeah.
It's really nice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
so
good
my shout out is to the people in the green uniform who've made it secure and safe for us. Yeah.
And Dee, what's your recap?
My midweek recap. I think we're just, in the interest of time, going to dive straight into things.
There was a big conference.
Yes, there was a big conference last week. Like I said, the Eisenhower Fellowships, the first regional conference in Africa. It took place last week from Friday to Saturday, and it was a great success. We had people from all over the world, especially the continent, coming through. And following the conference, as most conferences should be doing, ideally is that you have a bit of money staying back. So investments, people partnering and investing in some companies. Yeah, it was good to know. It was good to see that. Yeah, and just connecting Africans and fellows across the continent.
And you're an Eisenhower Fellow.
Yes, so moving on quickly. Frobisher, Paul Frobisher, thank you for joining the show. We're discussing Rwanda's national budget for the fiscal year 2019-2020. It's a dense topic, you know, it's numbers, it's economy, but we've structured it in such a way so we can have a discussion around it as ordinary citizens, and also with your expertise opinion. So my first question to you and also to the rest of the panel, if you'll allow me to read some numbers. So currently Rwanda's 2019-20 budget stands at 2.8 billion, thereabouts. Yes, trillion, sorry, francs, which is an 11% increase compared to last year. So key expenditure priorities for this year's fiscal budget include infrastructure, education, agriculture, health, private sector and youth development, as well as social protection. So my question to you to start off with is, as a person who lives in Rwanda, as a Rwandan citizen, what are some tangible changes you'd like to see based on the priority areas outlined by the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning?
Okay. Yes, thank you, Dan. If you look at the way the budget has been structured, especially the spend, I think you see the economic transformation has kind of taken the lion's share, about 57%. Now, if you followed the minister's speech, he kind of alluded to the fact that one of the interventions is going to be around job creation. And he gave some good numbers, looking at about 213,000 kind of new jobs onto the market. So if you look at those numbers, they're quite impressive. But I think you kind of need to sit back and say, what's our kind of gap in terms of unemployment? I think we have about 15% of people unemployed out of the workforce, which is 3.7 million. So that's around 570,000 people. So the minister promises 213 out of 570. So that's almost about 50.
But that doesn't take into consideration the new entrance into the job market.
Yes, and not even that. You still have, because if you look at the working age population, is about 6.8. But the guys we're talking about, these are the guys who are actively seeking employment. That's a 3.7. So you still have another 3.1 totally out before even you bring in the guys that are going to get in. So you find that as much as it looks brilliant, but I think there's still a lot of room to kind of consider. So then one kind of asks themselves, where are we going to get these jobs? The good news is that if you look at the 7.8 projection in terms of growth, it's very, very clear where it's going to come from. Service sector, agriculture, industry. If you look at service sector, the tempo is about 41%. So provided we are able to push that, probably the numbers could come in. But we still have a very, very big deficit. And maybe what again is scary is that even when you look at within the region, at 15% unemployment, countries like Kenya, Tanzania, they're about 7%. I mean, 10%, 9%. So we have a very, very big room. So what I would really want to see in terms of implementation, how do you close the gap? 15% is one of the highest we've had. Okay, we had about 17, but at least 15 is quite still high. And with all the education and everyone that's going to come out, this number can easily increase if it's not really tackled well. So brilliant budget. The minister is very conservative. He made 8.6 2018-2019. It comes at 7.8. Yeah, basically stay the course.
In terms of growth.
In terms of growth. So he has not really been that aggressive. Probably wants to make the magic number that it goes back to 8.6. But it's quite kind of telling on how it's going to break out, especially when it comes to the job market.
So your expectation is narrowing the gap of unemployment.
Yes,
based on
and
this
it's not going
budget.
to happen within I think what is really important is that what are the measures that are being put in place to actually bridge that gap? Because if you look at all the milestones that we are taking now, is that there are investments that are being made earlier. So, but what is scary that the gap at the rate that is being kind of closed is at a very slow pace. I mean, between 16 to 15, you could easily go back to 17.
% unemployment rate.
Unemployment.
I think I want to speak on that. So you know, there's So we know that majority of Rwandans are employed in the agricultural sector, but I think the vision of, because you have to look at also not just creating jobs, but job sustainability. When you look at the way the budget has been set up, there's an infrastructure investment, which is geared towards industrialization. Now, when you look at that, most people will be like, the jobs created in an infrastructure investment by the government are normally temporary. At least some would argue that. They would say it's a construction site, it's a construction project, maybe people will be employed for 24 months maximum, and these are also not high-level jobs. So what happens after? But what you can see is that there's this belief that if there is an investment in infrastructure, the industrialization aspect of the economy will also grow. Now that's where you have those jobs that now are longer lasting and are more sustainable and have at least an opportunity for upward trajectory for the people who actually attain those jobs. Now, when I look at the budget and I look at my expectations as Ephraim, there was an increase, I think, of 14% or 11%, I'm not sure between the two numbers, in the education budget. It went from 273 million to 311 million. Billion, sorry. And I know we've talked about this on the square. And actually, if I'm not wrong, that is the second highest spend for the government. It's interesting to see that, at least on my side, it's interesting to see that there's still an understanding of the need to improve the human capital in our country, as in that is what will ensure sustainable economic growth. Because on the flip side, you have this focus from government being, okay, we want to economically transform our nation and want to create jobs. But the question is, if we don't have the right kinds of skills to take up those jobs, how effective are we going to be? That's one aspect to it. But then there was also another aspect toward the increases in certain line items. And I know one that people would love to hear is the water and sanitation one. There's a 47% increase in the spending from last year to this year in water and sanitation, and hopefully it will improve the water situation in Kigali. I know people have complained about it. They're like, how are we getting water bills that are, how are we getting large water bills when we have not had water? And now that with the price increase in terms of the unit cost, you guys are charging us more for a service you don't give us. So hopefully this increase of 47% will improve. And then the last bit in relation to that is around environment and resources. There's also, it's the second highest increase as well. I think it's in the 30s in terms of 30% increase. And there's a huge investment in rehabilitating some of these areas. And we talked about this last week on the square. And again, I think it's interesting, and it's interesting to see that the heartbeat of the people is reflected in the budget. That when there's a concern around the environment and trying to understand why is there this big focus on this, that the government also understands it as well and is willing to invest. And the same thing with water and sanitation and so on and so forth around education as well. So it's interesting to see how it will pan out in the year. But again, I think when policymakers sit down and decide on these things, they don't do it based on 1 year. I think there's this long-term vision. I know the budget is based on NST1, the National Transformation Strategy, which has a long-term vision. So it's good to see that at least there's that trajectory and you can see where it's going.
I like the way you said that the hearts of the people are reflected in the budget. Very poetic words to use on such a technical topic. Prerna, what are your expectations as a Rwandan citizen regarding this fiscal year's budget, national budget?
One, it's always exciting, and it boosts confidence when we see that government is planning to increase spending, because as the key driver, the biggest employer, the more money they can spend, the more money you can expect in the economy. So it's good. And at the same time, you see that the spending is really prioritized and really quite prudent. They're being quite prudent. They're increasing spending, but also trying to contain debt, which, if you look at the region, countries are struggling with public debt. My concern is around infrastructure. Even if it takes the large share of the budget, and there's no doubt that we need infrastructure to move, to transition into the private sector-led economy. There's no doubt about that. But the reality is, when it comes to contracts around infrastructure, they're always an issue, you know, and if we go back to the Auditor General's report, you constantly see wasteful expenditure around infrastructure projects. So my expectation around that is, I hope that the people in charge of implementation will ensure efficiency, you know, in public contraction to avoid, you know, wasteful expenditure. Secondly, I was very pleased to see the increased spending around education. Yeah. There's no doubt that we still have a gap in the education system. Now, money is not necessarily a silver bullet. Increased spending does not always mean that it will fix issues. But again, I'm going back to efficiency. One of the key issues, for instance, at the moment, as much as we have quite an increase in the budget for education and teacher welfare, there's concern in schools around maternity leave. Why? Because most schools don't know where to get the money to pay the temporary contractors,
substitute teachers.
Yes, that come in for the 3 months. That's an issue. Now you wonder because, okay, the first step, of course, was getting the legislation to allow that. But at the moment, schools don't have the resources, and what that means is, as much as you're increasing expenditure in education, you can expect that that will be a problem because, you know, we still have women who have to go on maternity leave. So how do schools balance that? The other issue is on the private sector, industrialization and job creation. I think there has to be a lot of emphasis on sustaining businesses. Because on one hand, the expectations around jobs. But the thing is, if you have, for instance, because RDB is very good with business registration. So you have lots of businesses registering. But we don't look at the life cycle as such. And most of the time, businesses will come in and they will just, you know, a few years, 1 or 2 years down the road, they leave. Now, when we're increasing spending to fuel, you know, job, I don't know how that can be fixed again. So my expectation around that is agencies like RDB, I think, have to be more efficient in terms of due diligence, you know, for us to avoid a scenario where we have briefcase investors who come into the country, get big announcements, MOUs, get incentives. A few years down the road, they report losses, and then they leave, you know. That's one. And then two, reducing the cost of business, of doing business. Part of it is addressed, actually, the budget, fixing the infrastructure gap. The other bit, if you talk to businesses, one of the concerns, usually, the cost of doing business is high because of the high energy bills, you know, water, and then skills. How you get the critical mass of skilled people that can lower the cost of business, of doing business. Because at the moment, businesses spend a lot of money trying to get qualified people. So I would have loved to see more initiatives around apprenticeships, for instance, because if you have incentives for businesses to train, you know, to absorb graduates or even offer industrial training, then you can expect that at least you make headway in terms of addressing the skills gap. Because I don't think it's enough to just invest in universities.
And vocational.
And vocational
training. Interesting. The next segment is I want to discuss the issues, the implications on the taxpayer. And I think we've had this on the square multiple times. There's a time we even, I think, asked the question, what about, because the tax base is so small, you know, this is something we've discussed before. And my question to you, Frobisher, is on the implications regarding the Rwandan government expectations of financing this budget via domestic resources worth 1.9 billion, representing 68.3% of the entire budget. I want to ask your opinion to the panel. What do you think is the implication of this on the taxpayer, one? And number two, regarding tax amnesty. Do you think this is something that can be effected to improve on methods, on ongoing measures to improve compliance when it comes to tax?
Okay, quite a broad question, but maybe to start again with the budget numbers. Basically, domestic revenue collection at 1.9 trillion.
Yes.
Out of that, 1.7 is through tax revenue. Okay, so which means the other bit is domestic financing, and that contributes about 60%. Now, if you listen to the minister's speech, we didn't have any kind of either increase in taxes, so he was very, very careful. In fact, even mentioned that he was not increasing taxes. And it's kind of different from what we are seeing in other regions, because if you look at Uganda, Kenya, their approach to the whole tax policy is, can we have more rates? And that's why you see new measures around taxing mobile money, and then you have capital gains tax has been increased in Kenya and all that kind of thing. So it seems that in other East African countries, there's all this kind of approach to actually increase the tax, the kind of tax rates. Then one asks himself that, where is the government going to get the 1.7 trillion with the current tax base and maybe at the current tax rates, yet the minister has not increased. Now, what people do not realize that in the last 5 years, Rwanda has kind of used a three-pronged approach to either widening the tax base or deepening the tax base. So what they have done, that if you look at our acts, all the acts have been revamped. About 6 acts have been revamped. And why is the government doing that? You may not necessarily see that there's been an increase in rates, but through revamping those tax acts, the government has actually broadened the tax base. And I'll give you 2 simple examples. Right about last year, when the new act came into force, that was April 2018, you remember the threshold under presumptive tax reduced from 50 million to 20 million. And we're talking about that's now 30 million, meaning that people who were paying tax at 3%,
3%, yes.
Now all of a sudden started paying at 30%. And these are small and medium. So you're not going to hear an announcement that we've increased the tax rate to 30%, but by the mere fact that you've dropped the threshold, naturally you've gotten a number of guys who are paying at 3%, all of a sudden starting paying at 30% of their profit. Then they went ahead to remove guys under what we call liberal professionals, doctors, engineers, accountants. An accountant who was earning 50 million before the law changed and was self-employed was paying 3%. Yet, a similar accountant employed somewhere was paying 30%. So they say, okay, fine, all those should come off and then be under the real regime. So you can imagine how many people went into that. So the minister is not necessarily increasing the rate, but is playing around with the different kind of segments of people and being put into a particular category. Now, indirectly, actually, you're trying to broaden the tax base.
Yes.
And that's one approach. So the second approach has been around deepening. And deepening is normally what you do. You kind of tax the same people, the same income activities, but indirectly, again, increase the rates. And again, often you're not going to immediately see the rate. I think a number of multinationals have been victims to that. There was what you normally...
the choice of word you use, victims, is interesting,
Exactly.
but we'll get that. We'll get back to that later.
It's okay.
Yes,
yes.
yes.
But you will see that when the act was amended, they kind of created what you call new safe harbors, and they restricted 2% of management fees, technical fees, and royalty fees paid out. Now, what you've done is pretty much the income that originally almost paid 33%, all of a sudden pays 63%. So you are not saying that I'm going to charge 63%, but you've restricted what you call capital flight. Okay, and that naturally gives you more kind of revenue. Now, if you look at the budget framework, the minister came out and said, okay, fine, I'll get my revenue from from the key areas: services, agriculture, and industry. By the same time, with the change of this particular law, I'm going to get revenues from the amendment within the income tax law and the transfer pricing regime. So, getting back to your question, what does it mean to the local taxpayer? Some of them will see themselves moving into different thresholds. When it comes to, of course, multinationals, of course, it's going to be tightened in terms of capital flight, and I strongly believe we can still meet the 1.7 without necessarily increasing the rate, but just implementing the provisions within those particular.
Yeah, I want to add on that. One simple example, just to add to what he had mentioned about different ways the ministry or the minister they've played around with I'd say not necessarily increasing the tax, but managing how to collect more from deepening the tax base. There's one where he mentioned ring fencing mining concessions. So basically, what a mining company would do, like any business, if I have a profitable unit, let's say the business that sells sugar is profitable, but the one that sells coffee is loss-making. Because I'm producing one financial statement, I can just offset the loss, the profit from this one with the loss there, and then I pay less effective tax. But what that's saying is that if you, for mining companies, if you have one concession that's making a profit and another that's making a loss, you cannot offset. You have to have the loss for that one and pay the full profit on that one. So you file taxes separately. But I think for me, around how I think from the taxpayer's perspective, one area that really doesn't get talked about the most is around compliance. And we'll come into the conversation around tax amnesty. Compliance has always been one of the key strategies for the government to collect, at least to make sure that it hits that threshold of 1.7 trillion. Purely on the fact that you can tax people, but if you cannot collect that tax, it's worth nothing. So, for example, we've seen version 2 EBMs come into play. And the bit about version 2 EBMs, and an accountant will tell you this, is that the benefit of at least why it's called accounting, is that there's a system of accountability. There are checks and balances. For every debit, there's a credit. Now, the bit about version 2 is that it's an inventory management system. So I cannot sell products I've not bought. So you find that there's a way that it creates a sense of accountability across the whole value chain, at least for most of the economy that uses these systems. So you find that that's just one simple technique that's used, but helps collect a lot of value for the government in that context. And then beyond that, like you have a lot of, now coming into the conversation around tax amnesty. Now, for those that don't know what tax amnesty is, it's pretty much where the government comes to an agreement with a taxpayer to say, okay, look, in this context, you can pay this amount over this period of time without any sort of repercussions or penalties. And it helps, and it helps feed into compliance. Now, at least the way I saw it mentioned in the conversation around our national budget, what they were trying to do is, there are many people who are targeted by tax amnesty. But in the context of Rwanda, they're trying to target the informal sector. The biggest challenge at least with the informal sector you have in Rwanda is that when guys eventually come into, what people fear is when they come into the formal sector, they'll find all these penalties because they've been doing business for a particular period of time. Now, what you can see being proposed forward is, let's create this framework where when a company makes that transition or a businessman makes that transition from being informal to formal, they are not taxed, or at least they don't. They're not fined.
They don't come and find like a list of penalties
that they have to pay, and I think that in itself is a good move. Obviously, there are challenges around tax amnesty because, again, a lot of bigger entities and players play around with it. But I think that's compared when you do the cost-benefit analysis, the benefit is significantly higher towards compliance. So I think, from a compliance perspective, I think that's one of the, at least from a tax collection perspective, compliance is one of the big areas that the government, I think, believes it will be able to hit that target of 1.7 trillion.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
I
Farina?
think that it's good that we have more effort on mobilizing internal resources and several measures in that, to encourage that. But I feel that, like, if we take the tax amnesty as an example, I just try to look it up. Actually, opinion is very divided on the issue, on the effectiveness.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ambiguity around the benefits, especially in the long term, and the key risk being that there are companies that may take advantage of it, so it may actually discourage compliance. So for me, based on that, because there are several studies showing the ambiguity around tax amnesty, I think the focus has to be on internal administration and efficiency. Why? Because, like, you mentioned, it's one thing to increase compliance, but also be able to collect, what eventually ends up, at the treasury. The other thing is, I feel that there has to be a focus on reducing the tax burden, especially for vulnerable households. Because, like he's saying, there's a lot of pressure to get business formalized, to get them into the tax net. Whether that, in the long term, actually means that people will remain, I don't know. So I feel that there's a need to take a realistic look at the economy and ensure that the tax burden is not just on a few, because again, that has an impact on compliance. So how you strike a balance as a taxpayer, to reduce the tax burden, but also improve the administration, the internal administration. Because sometimes, Rwanda, for example, is well known for efficiency. Taxes, people can see what the taxes are doing. So it's not difficult to convince people that, you should pay. Yeah, but sometimes you find that compliance levels are affected by, administrative issues. And yet...
Administrative issues on the side of the taxpayer or the tax collector?
The tax collector. Administrative issues on the side of the tax collector. And yet, the penalties are quite heavy. And that is where, of course, the tax amnesty will come in. So I feel like RA is pushing the tax amnesty because their penalties are not being as productive as they should be.
Actually, there was a revision on the penalties as well.
Just go ahead.
Yes, and I want you to pick on what...
including your own opinion on the tax amnesty.
Exactly. And yes, she's right. There's divided opinion around tax amnesty. But again, I think that you need to look at it. At what point does the tax amnesty come in? So a number of countries, the first thing they do always is around widening the tax base. Now, what we've seen that, quote in court, maybe for Rwanda, we've out-widened, so you can no longer do much around it. Then the second step, you go into deepening.
As you explained.
Yes, there's still room for that. Now, the third step, as a policy measure that has always remained around, is actually tax amnesty. What you're looking at is, one, of course, revenue collection. Two, improve compliance. But of course, organizations like IMF World Bank will caution you on that or will discourage it, and for the reasons she has given. So any country, before they go into any tax amnesty, they basically ask two fundamental questions. Why is it needed and at this point in time? And are there any alternatives? And the alternatives is what she's talking about, that why don't you just improve the efficiency? Why don't we have a legal framework that is efficient enough to collect the taxes? Why don't we ease the tax collection? For example, what we are seeing in Rwanda, e-tax and e-payment and all that kind of thing. Now, if you have to respond to the second question, Rwanda has done extremely well, even within the region. You're talking about the legal framework. That's what you're talking about, that in the last 5 years it has done that. You have an efficient way of collecting tax. They introduced negative motivations in terms of people to comply.
What do you mean negative motivations?
Is what he was mentioning, heavy penalties.
Heavy penalties.
Yes, we have one of the very, very punitive penalty regime.
Exactly, in the region, yes.
Yeah. Now,
And hence the tax amnesty.
exactly, exactly. And that's why actually it comes in, that because you have a very punitive penalty regime, you have people willing to come to pay, but they actually discover themselves, okay, fine, if I'm going to pay this and I have almost 50% in tax, what's the motivation for me? And that's where the catch is. Right about 2012, almost the principal tax that was collected was equivalent to the penalty and
Wow.
interest.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
That's insane.
It has kind of just improved. In fact, I remember at one point when we were discussing with the Revenue Authority, and one of the senior people said, not until I see this number reduced, we shall always have the penalties up there. And somehow why I call it a negative motivation, then it discourages people to, and then of course they kind of get into compliance. So why I always said, is Rwanda now ready for tax amnesty? It's because of those reasons. You're quoting this arrangement whereby you have people that are not on your radar who are ready to pay, but they're not going to pay because of those heavy penalties. So what do? You either give that 6 months window, and there are a number of alternatives you can do it, okay? But you have to be extremely careful because you get into, like taxpayers, you have an implicit psychological contract between government and the taxpayer. The moment trust is lost, probably even the guys that were complying will say, no, I can start defaulting. After all, there will be another tax amnesty. So you don't want to create that kind of version, and that's why IMF and World Bank kind of, the moment you start it, people will always hope that you're going to create it. So you either put it within the law, okay, so that it benefits everyone, or you go the approach of identifying which sector should I give the amnesty.
Which is also what I was saying. Like from what I understood, from what I saw from this budget, is that the target market are not existing businesses that are not compliant.
You're talking about people in the informal sector.
Yeah, the idea is that these people, like you mentioned, that are off a certain radar, that would want to, or at least are now, they are going to a certain stage in their business and they want to plug in, but are worried that if they do that, there are all these penalties that they will face. And it comes down to that whole thing of widening the tax base. So or at least deepening it in that context. So I think in that way, I think they've thought about it. And I'll give credit where credit is due, because you can see that there is that practicality to it. But I want to digress a bit and talk about something that I think is a bit personal to me around the tax.
You are definitely going to do
that. No,
but is it brief? Because we haven't even got to the third part.
No. I'll keep it brief. No, So this one is around the taxing of NGOs. Before on the square, I've talked about this, and I've talked about it on various platforms around the way the social enterprises and NGOs are undermining the sustainability of our private sector, because these are institutions and companies that receive negative interest money, come into fields of the private sector, invest, don't pay any tax, undermine the competition of our private sector, and really affect our ability to perform as an economy. So when I saw that in this, that they are now
in the budget,
yes, they're now requiring these institutions to submit audited financial statements. So these are NGOs, churches, institutions, non-profit institutions, religious-based organizations, non-governmental organizations, to submit these returns. I was like, okay, it makes sense. Hopefully, the next stage will now be to tax them. But I think on that front, the desire is always that. Obviously, in the absence of a competitions authority that has, I think there was one in a cabinet meeting that said they want to set up one, a competitions authority. But in the absence of one, it would be nice to know that at least there's some sort of level playing field when it comes to tax with some of these institutions. Because again, it's not easy to compete with an institution that's not taxed and that receives money that it doesn't have to pay back or pay interest on. Yeah.
And unlimited amounts. I mean, we don't even know. Most of them are, receive the money from, philanthropists.
Payroll is paid from out of the country.
And then close after 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and then they leave the private sector in shambles. Yeah.
I want to get to our third question before we go to a social media feed. And this is a bit generic, and it's to do with like I said, the issue of domestic revenues assumed to contribute 68.3% to the national budget. Is this a positive indication that we're really on our way to self-financing? Do you think we will actually, in our generation, our lifetimes, see this Rwanda's quest of self-reliance and self-financing, where at least a significant portion of the budget will be funded domestically?
Okay. Yeah, and again, those numbers are interesting because when you talk about 68%, that is pretty much domestic revenue and domestic financing.
Financing, exactly.
Now, there's something else that you may need to consider. We have 18% on loans. So that gives you about 86%. So you can comfortably say that actually Rwanda is able to finance its budget at 86% because, again, the loans, you are given these loans because of your ability to make repayment.
Yeah.
Yes.
So currently, that whatever we are seeing that is funded by donors is 14%. And it could be 14% in the next 3-4 years, which is quite good. So well, as we are saying, revenues increasing. I think 2020, 2021, it will hit about 3.7 trillion. Debt is going to increase. We shall see the donor funds somehow stagnate at about 14%. So yes, in your lifetime, probably.
It's already happening.
It's already happening. And I think it's quite a very, very good mix. That we're at 86.
Including the loan financing.
Including the loan finance. And the loan finance is very key because, again, the way you see it, the way it's skewed, that is mainly targeting productive sectors. So you're not just getting loans for current expenditure. Because as it concerns current expenditure, we can cover by the revenue collections. So whatever you're getting is pretty much concession loans at very, very low interest rates and to kind of catalyze the growth and whatever that will kind of come through. So I'm very, very optimistic in terms of the minister's direction to kind of get into self-financing, and you will see it in your lifetime. So
Berna, you see.
No,
Thank you, Paul. Berna she seems very excited by Frobisher's words.
No, I'm very optimistic, and I think if we look at the ongoing efforts to support the private sector, you know, the Made in Rwanda initiative, the industrialization, the deliberate push to drive industrialization, the investments that are being made in infrastructure, linkages to I think you can see that if we remain on track, especially getting the efficiencies right, it is possible, you know, because then you have companies that create, you know, over 1,000 jobs that remain in business and you're able to tax them. Yeah. So I think it is possible, but again, there's no room for complacency. Yeah, in terms of efficiencies.
I think for me, it's numbers don't lie. Simple mathematical calculation will show you that we're on track. So, for example, our economy grows at what, 8%? This is what, $9 billion growing at 8%. Government budget is what, 2 billion of that, growing at 11%. So theoretically, just from a mathematical standpoint, especially with government being the largest driver of economic, let's say probably the largest singular expender in our economy, you find a situation where within, give it some time, like 5 years, if at least depending on our development agenda, but give it some time. Now I say 5 years depending on our development agenda. If we maintain the status quo as it is today, we could in 5 years. But I know Rwanda is a very ambitious country, so every new year comes with a new grand project, a new grand vision. So you find that we will be chasing, but from what just simple mathematics show us that 8% growth of $9 billion will definitely cover 11% of 2 billion.
I would be cautiously optimistic about those numbers because we need double digit to actually reduce poverty to a level where, you know, incomes are better and, you know, But
you see, you're talking of poverty. I'm talking of government. I'm talking of the government budget.
And also, there's a caveat around the transition that is happening from agriculture to the service sector. So far, research is showing that the jobs that are created in the service sector are not sufficient. The quality is not as good to be able to, you know, make the necessary transitions in the economy. So we need attention around the service sector, ensuring that, one, we have better jobs. We avoid a scenario of the working poor and the minimum wage. Yeah, I think with that, then, you know, we can talk about progress and all these things that Ephraim.
I want us to, I mean, Frobisher, is there something you want to add before we go to our social media page on self-financing. I think you want to say that.
Yeah, I think I've said most of it. Again, the emphasis here is that government will continue to borrow, and I think in media you've kind of had kind of questions that are we able to sustain that? But if you look at in terms of ability to pay or to repay, is normally measured on three fronts. Are you having a growing GDP, which we're having? Are you improving your exports, which are improving? Are you improving your fiscal revenue collection, which is happening? And all the three fronts we are actually meeting. So in terms of debt sustainability, I think we are there. It could be measured differently. Ministry of Finance says that it's about 32 point something.
Yeah, it's 32%
of GDP, but depending on what you put in there, it goes as high as 60 if you put government guarantees to private sector.
We have a green light from the IMF, and you can imagine how conservative the IMF is, but we have a green light.
And I get that, but as I said, it depends on what you include within the public debt to GDP. But we are there. I think what is really important is that we can sustain it, and provided we can sustain it, then you invest in productive kind of projects, you can pay back your loans, then that issue of being dependent on donor funds shouldn't be a big problem.
So in our lifetime?
You don't.
Definitely, it's already happening.
Yeah. So I'd like us to go to a Twitter feed, and then we have a couple of tweets that are coming in. And the first tweet is quite interesting. It's from Richard Gwajira. He's an avid follower and supporter of the Square. And he says, more and more people are embracing Made in Rwanda. It is working. Less imports and increasing taxes are coming from local industries. This allows us to finance our recurrent budget needs, hence no fear attitude by government to more spending. Okay. Creative taxation.
I think it has to be taken with a grain of salt, because I know we've had this conversation on the sustainability of some of these industries that we talk about, and what needs to be done in terms of the environment to help spur that growth, or at least ensure the sustainability of that growth. So for me, I agree with him. But we cannot start popping champagne and toasting to our victories just yet, because that's one part of the equation, and there's another part towards ensuring that these things can last.
That's sustainable.
And also to mention that there is concern within the private sector that funds allocated to the Export Guarantee Fund actually have been going down, from around 8 billion to 1 billion in this financial year.
So wait, that's huge.
Yes, Export Guarantee Fund.
Yes.
And yet,
but I remember, some time back also reading that the EGF also, in terms of allocating those funds, has not been that effective over the years.
Yes.
So that's the justification for the reduction.
Exactly.
But on the other side, it's accessibility. It's not as easy to access EGF.
Yeah.
And also, I think there has to be more effort in terms of marketing Made in Rwanda outside Rwanda, to create sufficient demand for these exports. Yeah.
What did you think about his comment, Paul? Creative taxation.
Yeah, and again, you get a number of terms, whether it's creative taxation or avoidance or whatever kind of come with. But I think when it comes to local solutions and Made in Rwanda kind of products, there's no substitute to that. You want to have import substitute on everything, so that you kind of manage your balance of payment. If you look at what the minister was pointing out, that okay, fine, why eventually we had our balance of payment kind of skewed, is because of imports mainly affected by transportation, which was affected mainly by the oil, the oil prices. So nothing will ever substitute kind of products made in country. So I think it's very, very important that, again, the focus of government when it comes to Made in Rwanda, the incentives are there, but there's this kind of lax, that the level of implementation. It seems as if it's on one side, it's highly popularized, but what you find read on ground,
Exactly.
there's no tangibility that you would kind of say, okay, fine, this is what we are saying. And the drive is on industry, but what extent can we really catalyze the value from these industries? If you still have cost of power up there, cost of transportation up there. So there are a number of ingredients that have to come in, even importation of raw materials, for you to actually achieve that. So I see it as a long-term kind of objective, provided we get the right funding in and is consistent around this. Yeah.
Our last tweet for the day is to do with the amnesty, the tax amnesty that we discussed earlier on. And this tweet is from Rwanda Confident, who says, first, including the tax amnesty is better for the big numbers to rise. Secondly, our generation is not yet ready for the government to invest in us. It's better they reduce taxes on new growing businesses than investing in people.
So I'm assuming that last bit around investing in us is around education.
Yes.
I don't think it's. So, for example, productivity in the private sector is normally driven by human capital. I'll give you very true honesty. Most businesses, the largest operating expenditure is payroll. And so that's your largest investment as a business. Yeah. That should be the largest source of your return. At least those are the people who should drive productivity in your company. So I don't think because at the end of the day, if I have I'll take my income statement, right? If you deduct from my gross profit, if you deduct my operating expenditures, you deduct my payroll, and I get my profit before tax, and then you reduce that rate, and I pay less. Theoretically, it puts money into my pocket as Ephraim. But if you look at it from the perspective of you maintain that high tax rate and the money, and I have better skilled people, it means overall the bottom amount is still the same amount of money, but I'm employing more people, there's more revenue to government. So I think the theory of it should be that let's invest in people. That's a given. Like, we cannot shy away from it. It's a must that we spend more on education. At least not just spend more, but get more for that amount of money that we spend in education.
Well, we've come to the end of the show. I would like us to just give very brief remarks. If you have some more, Berna and Ephraim, just very quickly before I hand over to Frobisher for closing remarks, any more comments on this interesting budget for this year that was released?
My final comment, again, goes back to efficiency around public expenditure. 2 incentives for the private sector to create jobs. We need also a focus on apprenticeships for students, and there has to be a deliberate focus on contracting local companies for government projects.
I like that. I like it. Ephraim, very quickly.
No, I won't comment on that. There's not enough time. But I think for me, it comes down to a reflection of the budget, a reflection of the people's concerns in the budget. You have to give credit where credit is due and say that it's good to see that our policymakers listen, especially when they see that there are needs in water and sanitation, there are needs in the environment. We have problems in education that need to be solved, and you can see it. There's a saying in the Bible. Sorry to quote the Bible on the screen, but allow me to do so. They say that your treasure is where your heart is where your treasure lies.
Which verse is that?
I can't remember.
Don't ask for details.
But the idea is that if you can see the government is willing to spend in those areas or increase spending in those areas, it shows that there's a concern. At least it's reflected through that.
Paul Frobisher, very quickly, closing remarks.
Yes, this is our second year of the
S2E15. Yes.
Okay. And I think naturally you kind of become impatient, and I think you've seen it here. That, okay, we need things to happen like yesterday. But if you look at government's approach, they've got a long-term view on all these things. I mean, you have about 7 years to really have this actualized. So I think I commend the minister for the kind of step he took, whereby you're almost staying the course. You're very, very sure of how you want to deploy your resources, and you really see there's not much panic within the budget, and you want that stability for you to achieve those kind of milestones within the program. So I think that's quite encouraging, and I'm more than optimistic that actually you will be able to get the 7.8 or even above it.
Economic growth.
Yeah, exactly, yes. Exactly. Given the infrastructure that is in place to achieve it.
Thank you very much, Paul Frobisher. It has been a delight having you and listening to your very insightful and expert comments. Ephraim, Berna, always a pleasure to have you. To our viewers who are watching, please keep the conversation going using our hashtag #TheSquareRW on Twitter. I would also like to thank our partners, Uzi Collections and Bourbon Coffee. Always great to have you on board with us. Have a good evening and see you again next week.